The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God, and they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us so that we will not perish." Then the sailors said to each other, "Come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity." They cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. So they asked him, "Tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you?" He answered, "I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." This terrified them, and they asked, "What have you done?" For they knew he was running away from the Lord, because he had already told them so. The sea was getting rougher and rougher, so they asked him, "What should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us?" "Pick me up and throw me into the sea," he replied, "and it will become calm. I know that this is my fault that this great storm has come upon you." Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew wilder than before. Then they cried out to the Lord, "Please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, Lord, have done as you pleased." Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. Once upon a time, there was a famous businessman who put an ad in the newspaper saying, "Responsible person wanted, lucrative job offer, very high salary." And he interviewed a lot of candidates until he narrowed it down to one person. He met with this man and said to him that the job offer is this: "I want you for the next 12 months to be responsible for all of my affairs. I want you to be responsible for running the entire operations of my business. I want you to be responsible for attending all of my meetings, answering all of my emails and phone calls. Be responsible for looking after our investors. Be responsible for looking after my employees, their performance reviews. Be responsible for traveling around the globe, staying in hotels to meet our clients. I want you to be responsible for all aspects of my business and my company. In addition to that, I want you to be responsible for all aspects of my personal life. I want you to look after my family. Be responsible for taking my kids to the park, dropping them off to school, dealing with any dramas that they might have, dealing with punishments, making sure that they are doing their homework. I want you to be responsible for cooking dinner. I want you to be responsible for doing all of the shopping. I want you to be responsible for looking after my wife and being attentive to her. I want you to be responsible for paying all of my bills. I want you to be responsible for my family holidays once a year. I want you to be responsible for visiting my elderly parents and visiting my friends. I also want you to be responsible for going to church once a week, responsible for reading my Bible, and be responsible for praying." The businessman said to him that, "I know that this is an enormous amount of responsibility, but I want you to know that if you take this job, I will pay you $5 million at the end of the 12-month period. The man agreed to the terms and accepted responsibility for the businessman's life and all of his affairs. And for 12 months, he took responsibility for running the man's business. He took responsibility for running the man's personal life. After 12 months, he came to the businessman and said, "I have been responsible for all aspects of your life for the last 12 months. Can I get my $5 million?" The businessman looked at him and said, "You have done a fantastic job. In these last 12 months, I have not had to take responsibility for any aspect of my life. You have done a fantastic job." And he signed a check for him for $5 million and said to him that if you want to work for me for the next 12 months, I would greatly appreciate it, and you will get another $5 million. The next day, the employee went to the bank to cash his $5 million check. And to his horror, the check bounced. The man went back to the businessman and said, "For the last 12 months, I have been responsible for all aspects of your life. I took responsibility for your business affairs. I took responsibility for your personal affairs. And you agreed to pay me $5 million. But when I went to the bank to cash the check, there was insufficient funds in your bank account." The businessman looked at him and said, "For the last 12 months, you have been responsible for all of my business affairs and all of my personal affairs. For the last 12 months, I have not had to take responsibility for any aspect of my life, which means it was your responsibility to make sure that there were sufficient funds in my bank account." Every single one of us has responsibilities. It's part of the human condition. We have responsibilities towards our family. We have responsibilities towards our friends. We have responsibilities towards our work. We have responsibilities towards our nation and our world. We have responsibilities towards ourselves and our own self-care. But most importantly, we all have responsibilities to God, our Creator. And no matter how much we try, we cannot avoid those responsibilities. No matter how much we try, we cannot run away from those responsibilities. No matter how much we try, we cannot pass those responsibilities onto somebody else. Every single one of us has responsibilities. And most importantly, we all have a responsibility to understand the death and resurrection of Jesus and to respond to the grace of God. That is not a responsibility that we can pass on to somebody else. That is not a responsibility we can run away from. Today we begin a brand new sermon series in the Book of Jonah called Facing the Task. Facing the Task. And we're going to look at 4 practical lessons from the life of Jonah that we as followers of Jesus can learn from and carry these lessons into the new year. Now, the first theme that we're looking at today is titled Fleeing from Responsibility. Fleeing from responsibility. Now, Jonah was a prophet, and we know that the role of a prophet was an official position amongst God's people, the nation of Israel. Now, it wasn't a political position per se, but prophets did exercise a tremendous amount of authority and influence over God's people. They were the spiritual lifeline, if you would, for God's people, calling them back to right and authentic relationship with God. But one of the things that makes Jonah a very interesting prophet is, unlike the prophets that we are typically accustomed to reading about, prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Joel, Zechariah, and the like, we don't typically get given very much information about Jonah's words or his speeches or his prophecies, if you will. Rather, we get given a glimpse into a few small details of Jonah's life And it's from these details of Jonah's life that we are called to learn something about how we interact with God. And the details of Jonah's life are not communicated in just a straightforward historical manner. No, there are details and elements of satire in the way that Jonah's story is actually told. But what's most remarkable about Jonah's life is that unlike the great library of prophets that we read about in the Old Testament, Jonah is unique in the sense that he is a bit of a mixed bag. In fact, he isn't really a very faithful prophet from what we see about his life. No, he rejects the calling that God gives him. He flees from responsibility. He's angry with God. He's resentful of God and how the mission that God sends him on. And for this reason, I think that Jonah is one of the prophets that we as followers of Jesus today can learn a lot from. Because Jonah in many ways resembles the same weaknesses that we have when it comes towards our relationship with God. You see, we go through seasons of rejection of God. We go through seasons of rebellion of God's will. We go through seasons where we can be resentful about what God is doing in our life. And today, as we begin looking at this theme of responsibility, and we look at the theme of responsibility through the great responsibility that was given to Jonah, I have just a few points of application for us here today. And the first is this: take on the correct amount of responsibility. Take on the correct amount of responsibility. It is very important from the outset to define what taking on the correct amount of responsibility looks like. You see, because when we speak about responsibility, we're really speaking about two things: response and ability. Response and ability. And you see, there's a big difference between a person who takes on too much responsibility and a person who takes on too little responsibility. And actually, both are very dangerous for us, but for very different reasons. And that's why I want to start off by talking about what it means to take on the correct amount of responsibility. Because we know that a person who takes on too much responsibility, they might have the right response to life. They might be energetic. They might be motivated. They might want to help other people. They might want to do right by every person in their life. But you can have the right response, but not the right ability. And the truth is that in life, people that take on too much responsibility are at great risk of things like higher stress, higher anxiety, and higher risk of burnout because we take on too much responsibility. We have the right response and the right motivation, but not the ability to help everybody. You see, in life, you can't take on too much responsibility. You can only take on what God has entrusted to you. There are people in the world who want to solve all of the world's problems. They want to solve the problems of all of their family members, the problems of all of their friends. They want to take on all the responsibility at work and not give responsibility over to other people. And friends, that is dangerous. That is taking on too much responsibility. But then we have the people who are the opposite. They're the people who take on too little responsibility. You see, they have the ability, but not the correct response. They're lazy. They're unmotivated. They want other people to do everything for them. They don't work hard. They don't look after the household, or they expect other people to do all the work for them. That they're lazy in their spiritual walk with God. They want to be spoon-fed everything. And that's dangerous for a very different reason. But as followers of Jesus, our responsibility is to find the middle ground, to take on only that which has been entrusted to us by God and not to exceed our boundaries. And not to say, I'll be the type of person who takes on the problems of all people in the world. But at the other side of the spectrum, to be one of those lazy people who says, I'll get other people to do all the work for me. I won't help out in the house. I won't take responsibility for raising my children. If I go to work, I'll just lay back and let other people do all of the work and take credit for what they've done. And we all know people in our life who fall into those two extreme camps. We all know people in our life who take on too much responsibility and they try to solve the problems of everybody. When they have family and friends who are going through issues, those people's issues become that person's issues and they become ineffective. In Galatians, Paul gives us an important principle where he says that every person must carry their own load. You can't be the person who fixes everybody's problems. You can't be the person that takes on the responsibility for everybody in your household. No, you have to let every other person carry their own load and carry their own responsibility. But at the same time, we all know people who are lazy, people who are unmotivated. They just want to stay at home all the time playing video games or stay at home watching Netflix or watching YouTube. They're like that teenager who frustrates his or her parents because they don't want to take initiative and ownership for their life. And the Bible says in 1 Timothy that anyone who does not provide for their relatives and especially their own household has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Now, in the context, Paul is talking about lazy believers who don't want to look after the vulnerable in his community. But I think the same principle applies today, that any person who doesn't take ownership of their life, who doesn't take initiative for their life that God has blessed them with, that person is walking the line of rejection of God because they are not the good and faithful servant who are doing well with the talents that God has given them. But let's look at how this plays out in the story of Jonah. Listen to this. It says, "Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God. And they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, 'How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us, that we will not perish.' Then the sailors said to each other, 'Come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity.' They cast lots, and it fell on Jonah. So they asked him, 'Tell us who is responsible for making all this trouble for us.'" Now, as this crisis was going on, do we see what Jonah is doing? He's sleeping. That's what he's doing. He is sleeping. Not only has he not taken on the responsibility that God has given him, but then when a crisis hits, he doesn't take responsibility of helping the other crewmen. He just goes to sleep while they're working hard to try to stabilize the ship and to try to save their own lives. Jonah doesn't do anything to help out. He just goes to sleep. So he's not taking responsibility for this situation in his life. And we've all met people who are like that, where they don't want to take on responsibility. And what's remarkable is that during this crisis in these men's life, Jonah, the one who has an authentic relationship with the true and the living God, doesn't call upon his God. He doesn't call upon his God. As followers of Jesus, we must take responsibility when there are trials and difficulties to call upon our God for help. But Jonah doesn't do that. He doesn't want to take on any responsibility for this situation. So who has to take on responsibility? It's the other crewmen. It's the captain. They're the ones taking on responsibility, trying to save the ship, trying to find out what is possibly going on spiritually that could be impacting their current situation. And as followers of Jesus, it's important that we learn to take on the right amount of responsibility. If you're the type of person who takes on too much responsibility, the new year is a good opportunity for you to revise your life and the direction you're going, and to look at what areas of your life have you been taking on too much responsibility and others around you need to take on more responsibility. But if you're the type of person who lacks motivation, who you expect others around you to do everything for you, the new year is a good opportunity for you to review the areas of your life where you need to take on more maturity and more responsibility. But the second point that I want to talk about when we talk about this concept of responsibility is this: distance yourself from the irresponsible. Distance yourself from the irresponsible. Listen to what the text says. The sea was getting rougher and rougher. So they asked him, "What should we do to make the sea calm down for us?" And this is Jonah's reply: "Pick me up and throw me into the sea, and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you." So in other words, what Jonah recognizes is that it is his responsibility for why this storm has come about on these men. And Jonah says to the men that if you don't get rid of me from your life, you are going to drown, and this storm is going to continue. So in other words, Jonah is the irresponsible one in this situation, causing this calamity for these other crewmen. And isn't that an image of life? That the irresponsible people in our life and in our world tend to be the ones who cause calamity and destruction for the rest of us. If you have somebody in your life who's irresponsible, what does that do to you? It puts extra pressure on you to take the load. It puts extra pressure on you to compensate for that person's irresponsible nature. And God doesn't want us to do that. He doesn't want us to take the load from other people when they are being irresponsible. The irresponsible people in our lives will bring us into destruction. If you have people in your life who are immoral people, who are irresponsible with the way that they honor God in their lives, they're irresponsible on the types of programs they watch. They're irresponsible with the way they use their finances. They're irresponsible with the way that they treat other people. The more you surround yourselves with those people and you allow them to influence you, the more likely you are to fall into destruction. We all know those people who at one time or another had a strong relationship with God, a strong responsible relationship with God, and they allowed themselves to fall into destruction because they attached themselves to people who didn't share the same responsibilities to God that they share. They surrounded themselves with irresponsible people. Now, as followers of Jesus, to live out our faithful calling to make disciples of all nations, we do have to surround ourselves with people who don't think like us. We do have to surround ourselves with people who don't have the same relationship with God as we do. But we must never be influenced by the irresponsible person or the irresponsible people in our life. We can never let their irresponsible nature cause us to fall into sin, cause us to fall into calamity like Jonah does to these crewmen. And when we look at the response of these crewmen, I find it fascinating, for it says that instead the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew wilder than before. In other words, these men, when they identified that Jonah was the irresponsible person amongst them, Jonah was the irresponsible person who hadn't honored his God, they did their best to try correcting the problem. You see, in this culture, people who worshipped different gods believed that there were gods who looked after different parts of nature. There was the god of the sun, there was the god of the oceans. And what these men would have thought when this calamity hit them is that one of the men on this crew have not honored their God. And when they find out that it's Jonah who's not honored their God, more so, not only has Jonah not honored his God, but Jonah has not honored the true and the living God who controls the sky and the seas. They realize that he is the irresponsible one who has not done right by his God. But what do? Instead of getting rid of him, no, they try to row back to land. They try to overcompensate for Jonah's irresponsibility. And friends, that is sometimes like our life. When there are people who are irresponsible in our lives, we try to overcompensate for their irresponsibility. We say, no, they'll grow up one day. They'll mature one day. They'll stop their irresponsible behavior. Maybe eventually they will come to God. Now, friends, we can never compensate for people's irresponsibility. Not like these men who tried to row back to land to get into safe waters. Our final point is this: we must all accept responsibility for our actions. We must all accept responsibility for our choices in life, our actions in life. Listen to what the text says. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. In other words, Jonah receives instructions from God. This is your responsibility, Jonah, to go and proclaim this message to this wicked city. This is your responsibility. And what is the choice Jonah makes? But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed to Tarshish. He ran away from the Lord. In other words, he doesn't just run away from the task, but he runs away from the Lord. He could have stayed where he was and said, no, I'm not going. But not only does he run away from the task, he runs away from the Lord. And it says he went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee, not from the task, but to flee from the Lord. Where does Jonah go? He goes in completely the opposite direction. When we look at the map, where does Jonah go? Well, Nineveh, the great city, is about 800 kilometers northeast of where Jonah would have been in Israel. So roughly the distance between Sydney and the Gold Coast. That's where Jonah had to go, that distance where many people are traveling now for holidays. But where does Jonah go? Well, Jonah, in his sin, goes west. He goes virtually in the opposite direction to where he is supposed to go. Now, we don't know where Tarshish was. Some have speculated that it was around where Greece was, around where Crete was. But others have speculated that it was as far as Spain. Now, if that is correct, that it is as far as Spain is, that was basically their understanding of where the ends of the world was. They didn't really understand what we understand today about the size of the earth. So they thought that where Spain was basically the end of where the earth was. So he goes as far away from God as possible. Now, if Tarshish was in Spain, that is, check this out, roughly 4,000 kilometers in the opposite direction. 4,000 kilometers. Basically the width of Australia from coast to coast, Sydney to Perth. That's where Jonah goes, completely in the opposite direction, to get away from the calling that God has put on his life. You know what it's called when God gives us one instruction and we do completely the opposite? That is sin. Jonah runs into sin. He turns away from God and goes in completely the opposite direction. The story of Jonah is powerful for us today because it is a picture of sin. You see, if we could sum up the message of all of the prophets in the Old Testament, the primary message that they spoke to people was this: return to me and I will return to you, declares the Lord Almighty. That is the nutshell of what the prophets proclaimed. But the Bible says that we are all like sheep. We have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way. That's the definition of sin. What Jonah does is he turns his back on the Lord and goes in completely the opposite direction. And the biblical word that we translate today as repentance in the Old Testament was the word shuv. It meant return. It meant turn away from your sin and return back to the Lord. What Jonah should have done when disaster and calamity hit that ship is he should have said to these men, not throw me overboard, but instead, no, we can end this calamity if we turn the ship around. You see, God would have stopped the storm had they turned the ship around and said, we're going back to where Jonah needs to be. But what does Jonah do? He stays in his irresponsible nature. And he says, pick me up and throw me into the sea, and then it will become calm. But what's ironic about Jonah's running away from the Lord is he says, I am a Hebrew and I worship the Lord, the God who made the sea and the dry land. Well, Jonah, here's the hypocrisy of your running. That if you worship God, then why are you running? If you worship God, why are you running? You see, an irresponsible person doesn't accept the consequences for their actions. An irresponsible person doesn't accept responsibility for their life choices. You know, we can be like the religious hypocrite like Jonah sometimes. Oh, no, we worship the Lord, yet we're running from the Lord. Yet we're not returning to the Lord. But Jonah makes only one honest confession. Only one honest confession in the start of this story, where in verse 12 he says, I know it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you. I know that I am to blame for this situation. That is the start of repentance. That is the start of returning to God. That is the start of being a responsible follower of Christ. It is a person who accepts responsibility and says, I know, Lord, that it is my fault that this is happening. Accept responsibility for your faults in life and where you have gone wrong. Don't blame other people for your sin. Don't blame other people for your anger. Don't blame other people for your resentment, your bitterness. Don't blame other people for the stress in your life. Don't blame your boss for your dissatisfaction at work. Don't blame your parents for how they raised you. Don't blame your kids. Don't blame your addiction to pornography on the world around you. Don't blame the media. Don't blame politicians for all of life's problems. Don't blame your church for your spiritual immaturity. No. Accept responsibility for your life choices and actions. Now, I'm not saying that other people may not be responsible for areas of problems in our life. Other people do things at times to us in life that cause us to have problems and pain. But a mature person who accepts responsibility
for their life is a mature person who says, God, I'm not going to blame my past. I'm not going to blame people around me, but I'm going to accept responsibility for how I respond to your death and your resurrection on the cross. You see, Jonah didn't want that. He didn't want to accept responsibility and return to God. He wanted to keep running. But as far as he tried to run, as much as he tried to swim, God was relentless in his pursuit of Jonah. And that's why the story of Jonah is so powerful, because God is relentless in his pursuit of us. And ironically, who is it by the end of this chapter that returns to God? It's the people who Jonah didn't want to go to in the first place. The people on board the ship, it says, greatly feared the Lord and offered sacrifices to the Lord and made vows to him. And at the end of chapter 4, it is the people of Nineveh who return to the Lord, not Jonah. By the end of the story, Jonah's heart is still far away from God. Jonah is still stuck in his irresponsible nature. But it's the people of Nineveh who have returned to the Lord. I want to close with this story. A few years ago, there was a lifeguard named Tommy working a shift on a beach in Florida. And as Tommy looked out, he saw a man drowning. The man wasn't swimming between the flags or the designated safe zone where lifeguards can look after you and protect you. He was swimming outside. But Tommy abandoned his post and without thinking jumped into the water, swam out and pulled this man back. And he was already blue, having taken on so much water in his lungs. And Tommy saved the man's life. He saved the man's life. But despite saving this man's life, you know the response of the private company who hired Tommy? You know what their response was? Their response was to fire him. They fired Tommy for doing the job of a lifeguard and saving this man. Now, why did they do it? Why did they fire him? They fired him because they said that there's an insurance issue here. That there was a rule that a lifeguard on duty was not to abandon their post to rescue somebody who was struggling if they were swimming outside the designated safe zone or outside the flags. Because the issue was that in the time that they abandoned their post, somebody in the safe zone who thought they were swimming in a safe area, who thought they would be protected if something happened to them, well, if a lifeguard wasn't there, what would happen? So it was an insurance issue. And they fired him. But then out of response in protest, other lifeguards started to quit because their point was this: a lifeguard is a lifeguard, regardless of whether or not the person swimming is doing the right thing. No, a lifeguard is a lifeguard, no matter what. And this is the problem with Jonah, is he doesn't want to be a prophet to other people. He doesn't want to be a prophet outside of the flags. No, Jonah wants to stay amongst his own people. He doesn't want to go out. The picture of Jonah, his story is powerful because it shows and it illustrates God's concern, not just for the nation of Israel, not just for his own people, but it shows his care and concern for all people. God takes responsibility not just over a select few, but he takes responsibility for all people, for all society, for all humanity. And he wants his lifesavers, his lifeguards, to take responsibility for going out to all people, not just to stay in their safe zone. But Jonah doesn't want that. He doesn't want to be a prophet who reaches all people. He doesn't want that responsibility. But we find out at the end of the story why Jonah is irresponsible. It isn't because he's afraid for his own life. It isn't because he's afraid of going to wicked Nineveh where anything could happen to him. No. The reason is this. It's because Jonah knows that God is a compassionate God who forgives people for their sins. And Jonah, in his wicked, irresponsible attitude, he doesn't want the people of Nineveh to repent. He doesn't want God's compassion to be given to other people in need. And how often in life do we embody that same irresponsible attitude? You know, sometimes we think, oh no, God, I can get away with my irresponsible actions. I can get away with my wicked and immoral lifestyle because you're a compassionate God and I know that you'll forgive me. You see, Jonah thinks that he can just flee from the Lord, flee from this responsibility, and he can go and live peacefully and nothing will ever happen to him and God will leave him alone. But friends, God does not allow us to stay in our irresponsible lifestyles. You see, the people of Nineveh were like us today. You see, our world is littered with those who have rejected God. Our world is littered with people living an immoral lifestyle. And God has called us back to Nineveh, back to our society, back to Sydney in the year 2022, back into the world to lead people who have been living an immoral lifestyle back to Him. The question is whether or not we will take on board this responsibility, or are we like Jonah and we're going to say, no, God, I want to flee from this responsibility.
Thanks for joining us online today. We pray and hope that God has really and truly blessed you through our service, through the message, through the worship we shared. And please feel free at any time to contact us via email or a phone call or through the app if you have any prayer requests or questions, and we'd love to be there to connect with you. God bless you.
Oh, I'm so excited.
I know you are.
I've worked so hard on the set and design.
And they really look great.
I mean, it's always been my dream.
I know it has. Hi everyone, I'm Chrissy.
And I'm Jem.
And today I am going to be telling a true story from the Bible.
And I'm gonna help.
Yes, you are. Now this story is from a book in the Bible called Jonah. And today we're going to look at Jonah chapters 1 and 2.
Right. Should I go get ready?
That sounds like a great idea.
Woohoo!
Now Jem and some of her friends have made the set and the puppets, and they are going to help me tell this story. But I'm actually going to need everyone else's help as well. While I tell this story, some of the time I'll say he knew, or Jonah knew, or they knew, or we know, or something like that. And when I do, I want everyone to join in saying this: God's a God of grace, and God's a God of kindness. He's slow to anger and abounding in love. Now you might be wondering what I'm doing with my hands. I'm actually speaking another language called Auslan while I do these words. So how about we see if we can all do it together? It starts like this. We know God's a God of grace. Can you do that with me? God's a God of grace. Good job. Now that word grace, well, that just means all the amazing things that God gives us even though we don't deserve it. And then we go, God's a God of kindness. Your turn. God's a God of kindness. And then we go, He's slow to anger and abounding in love. Try that. He's slow to anger and abounding in love. And that big word abounding, well, that just means lots and lots and lots. That's how big God's love is. Excellent. Now let's see what happens in the story of Jonah. Jonah was a prophet from God.
Hello, I'm Jonah, and I'm a prophet from God.
One day, God said to Jonah, Jonah, get up and go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. Now, Jonah had heard lots of things about Nineveh. Nineveh was the capital city of a country called Assyria. And the Ninevites and the Assyrians were mean and nasty people. They would hurt others, they would kill others, and they would take over other people's land.
Hurt, kill, take.
And Jonah was an Israelite. And the Israelites and the Assyrians, they were enemies. So you might think that Jonah would have been pretty happy if God had told him to go and preach against Nineveh.
Woohoo!
But Jonah was not happy with this job, because Jonah knew, everyone, God's a God of grace and God's a God of kindness. He's slow to anger and abounding in love. So Jonah knew that if he went and told the Ninevites that God was angry with them, maybe they'd change, and then, well, God might forgive them. But these were Jonah's enemies. He didn't want that. And so, when Jonah heard God say, Jonah, get up and go to Nineveh, Jonah got up and went the other way. In fact, Jonah went and found a boat with some sailors on the water, and Jonah jumped on board. Soon Jonah was sailing in the exact opposite direction from Nineveh. And Jonah told the sailors with a laugh in his voice,
I'm running away from God.
You sure that's a good idea?
Yeah, he'll never find me out here.
Oh, okay, cool.
Well, for quite a while, everything was going along fine. So eventually, Jonah went downstairs for a rest.
Hey, fellas, I'm really tired out. I'm going to go downstairs and have a rest.
Sleep tight.
Don't let the bed bugs bite.
So Jonah went peacefully to sleep. But Jonah should have known that, everyone, God's a God of grace and God's a God of kindness. He's slow to anger and abounding in love. And God wanted the Ninevites to hear his message, so he was not going to let Jonah get away that easily. So while Jonah was asleep, God sent a strong wind upon the sea, and the waves started to get bigger and bigger.
All hands on deck!
The storm got bigger and bigger, and it looked like the boat might fall apart. The sailors were terrified. And they all called out to their own false gods.
Help us!
But it didn't work. The storm got bigger and bigger. So the sailors thought they were going to die.
We're all gonna die!
The captain of the ship looked around and saw that Jonah was not above board helping. So he ran downstairs and he woke Jonah up.
Wake up, wake up! Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will save us.
So Jonah woke up and came above board, but still the storm raged on and on. Well, eventually the sailors decided they would have to find out why this was all happening. And they discovered that it was Jonah's fault. He told them,
My God is the one who made the heaven and the earth and the sea.
well, when the sailors heard this, they were terrified.
You're running away from him? Are you crazy?
So they asked Jonah.
What should we do to make the storm stop?
Jonah knew that the storm was all his fault. So Jonah said,
If you want to be saved, you'll have to throw me overboard.
well, the sailors didn't want to do this, but the storms kept getting bigger. And so eventually they grabbed Jonah and they threw him into the sea.
1, 2, 3!
As soon as Jonah was thrown overboard, the storm stopped. And the sailors were amazed at God's power.
Whoa! What a God!
The sailors were now learning that God's a God of grace And God's a God of kindness. He's slow to anger and abounding in love. Meanwhile, Jonah was sinking. And as he sank, the water swirled around him. He was tossed back and forth by the currents. He felt that death was upon him. And at last he cried out,
Oh God, my God, I know you can save me. Please help.
and suddenly God provided a way for Jonah to be saved. A great big fish came and swallowed Jonah whole. It would have been stinky and yucky, but Jonah realized that God had saved him. And so from inside the fish, Jonah prayed.
I praise you, God, my God, that you have rescued me. You are the God of salvation to all who will call to you.
And then, after 3 days and nights, God commanded the fish and it vomited him out onto shore. See, Jonah was having to learn what he already knew, that God's a God of grace and God's a God of kindness. He's slow to anger and abounding in love.
Wow, that was so much fun.
You did so well, Jem.
Thanks, but Jonah didn't.
Well, no, he didn't.
I mean, he just completely disobeyed God.
That's right, he did.
So he did not deserve God to be kind and loving to him.
Well, no, but Jonah was learning that God is a God of grace and kindness to him.
Yeah.
But the Bible tells us that God's grace, God's kindness, and God's love was not just towards Jonah, it was also towards Jonah's enemy.
But Jonah was learning that the hard way.
He sure was. But you know what?
What?
We know even more than Jonah.
You do?
Well, yeah, because the Bible tells us that we can know God's grace, God's kindness, and God's love through Jesus.
Through Jesus?
Well, yes, God's grace and kindness and love led to God giving us Jesus to pay for all the times that we've disobeyed and ignored God as well.
Cool.
And now we have been given a command just like Jonah had. The Bible tells us to tell all people, even the people who we don't like and who don't like us, about God. And why do we do this? Well, because we know God's a God of grace and God's a God of kindness. He's slow to anger and abounding in love.
Whew, I could do this much better if I had 2 hands.
Sure you could, Jem.
Well, I'm going to go and get my team together to practice the next installment of the Jonah story.
That is a great idea.
See you later.
See you, Jem. Well, we've created some games and craft ideas and discussion questions that you can check out at quizworks.com/home delivery. And next time, we will see if Jonah learns the lesson that God's grace and kindness and love is for everyone. See you next time.
This is amazing grace. This is unfailing.